so we can get to Dr. Dunisa and ask where are our votes.
And we know we start our program. We always start our program with a prayer. Because there is a movement of everyone. It is a movement of every character in society. So let's start our program by inviting Bishop Soweto, and I'm also the commissioner of employees in Gauteng, and I'll be running the program of the day. Having said that, I'm going to allow Bishop Soweto to take us in prayer. Bishop. Zuma. South Africa. Kaya imani bibilini badile. Muna ya malito Abraham, isin Abraham, bilito la ngene Abraham. Muna ya nasna bana, muna kwa mtestono na mtimo kudima wote wa hai. Bore aye na batmama kata batululuwa South Africa. Matapata jere ya matapata ya hai polisi ndio. Mofemata amshanya na wale wote 70. Ora ono peta hata mosebeti di monte wena mo ngati nto. Kila bella de national high command, kila bella moya wa unity. Kila bella moya wa kutwa. Kila bella moya wa kubo. Kala national high command, le kala provincial, le kala de president of South Africa. Akolo do fita ufati dividi rabella moya wa kwa habete yena It's valid chaka, who not organize at that swallow. It's one more Yamarato, this is so who try to go up in a line. Los Setula, Recopatella, it's only Pahani, it's only normal of the state.
Celebration siyathemba wokulandelayo ukulungiswa. Siyabusela kwindondo kubo bonke abokhokho sihlala nihlonipheni lo hlelo. Siyathokoza sithi ngamangu reviliseni pula. Siyabonga kwindondo kuyishintsha nezomoya. Sivusa abangasekho, sivusa abasentabeni abasemaweni, sivusa abagijima emfuleni abagijima emakade. Sigijima sivusa bonke okhokho esibaziyo nesingabazi. Sivusa abalela nenkululeko. Sivusa sicela umbuso obuyele kubantu bethu. Sivusa kumandini kumandawo. Sivusa kumabutho. Sivusa kumaphosa kakhulu sibayele. Sivusa kumanolo. Sivusa kuzo zonke iy'shintshalo kuyimfundo uqobo nasemanzini. Singathethanga bala. Siyacela siyabonga okhokho. Sibonga ukuthi sigcinele ukunqamalala. Sibonga sicela kini sikhuthaza lapho nikhona ukuthi nongeze iy'nsuku zakhe akwazifeza lenkululeko yabantu abamnyama. Siyakhuthaza sicela singabantwana benu. Siyacela sifumbe siqonde umfanekiso omuhle wabagqamatha wabazibelimani. Sibumbeni singabantu nibuseni isithunzi sakwantu. Busani namakhosi nibuyiseni umhlaba wethu. Busani nayibhozo nibuyiseni umnotho wethu. Siyacela kini bokhokho ukuthi nisihambele phambili nishayele lokho okungafanelanga ukuthi kumele endleleni yethu. Ngoshani ibolekile ezingezayo ngaphakathi kwe-MKP. Bimbani izifo nezemali abazimasilayo. Siyacela kini bokhokho kungani lapho likhona ningazilathi ndalabesheya ndawoni makhulu.
Our relationship with Commander Zuma started during hard times. You know, we want to overseas. When you take a talk to want to overseas, there is a right to want the war. That right to say, want to overseas or to make a shield. And the spirit of the nation for that, we internalize that feeling when we are still in the camps. MKP is down. And we were taught about three revolutions for the overseas. That's unity, bravery, and self-sacrifice. That is the message that we want to lead to this MKP participant. Because it's a revolutionary movement. Our relationship with the former president, Protea, with commander-in-chief, is not yet seen very clear. Our commander-in-chief has gone through hard times, has gone through challenges, but soldiers of the overseas will always decide to command in Soweto. Even when they were saying that commander-in-chief were there, they did that with him. No matter how commander also don't go overseas, so they want to commander. What is his father? What is his father? So remain this year, I'm sure that you're going to see from
President Zuma's legacy is rooted in the struggle from FA churches, Protea Island, and exile to leading a democratic South Africa with a deep understanding of the people's lived experiences. He is celebrated not only as a freedom fighter, but also as a revolutionary who placed women at the center of leadership, decision-making, and societal change. We want to say to our president today, long live President Zuma, long live. Viva FK, viva! Viva FK, viva!
When I'm speaking about President Jacob Zuma, but I guess that then we have to get leadership that is going to take us through the election. But everything, all of the things is that in actually celebrating the legacy of President Zuma, I think the best way to celebrate that is to give and strengthen people to the party, for it to become, to be the first to take over state power and deliver local liberation. And in doing that, we need to capacitate its membership so that because we don't only need activists but political leaders who are going to allow people in parliament and make sure that when they decide to articulate the respective political system and policy making and legislation making, we can have strong data that will be able to contextualize the perspective of political system and advocate for it so that we become an organization that can deliver total freedom to the people of South Africa. So in order for us to honor the life of President Jacob Zuma, we need to work very hard in ensuring that people who are supposed to organize the organization and to send selflessly this organization of ours. And also, I wish also to make a point to all people and people who are present here and who are watching here, that as we progress to the UK, we are working for the progressive one, only that they must assist us in order for us to be able to advance the cause of liberation. You are the UK that will be fighting to have people for demanding justice for God. And yesterday, we were that UK that will be fighting to the electoral court to demand justice for those of South Africa who voted in the party. We are saying that the fight continues. Now we want to take the fight to hold us up. We are aware that people are suffering. This is not the people are suffering in South Africa because the issues of water, the issues of electricity, and we want to go to that extent for taking the fight and ready to go to the issues that they must give us the services. They must give us the services. With another issue that we see today this morning that someone who attended our march yesterday because we don't know that much that considered that education and without teaching that person passed away. So those are the kind of issues that we are facing every single day. That plenty of that is why you think that is nothing is why you think that is unemployed. We are young people that actually don't know where the next thing will come from, but we are going to fight and fight and fight to ensure Zuma, with a fight against HIV to a level we have never seen before. During those days, HIV AIDS was a death sentence, with almost every family knowing someone who passed on to the disease. Normally, antiretroviral therapy and the rest was targeted mainly those infected ones within the community sectors. Now, our NGOs is directing me, and I will force to definitely commit what I have today. When we raise issues with our own government, most of the time have to be national congress. Nobody even give us here as our
Commanders, we would like to thank Zuma. We would like to say happy birthday to Zuma Commanders in Soweto. And we need to think that you are very happy all the commanders that recognize us. And also we would like to thank the High Command, Presidency, United States, for recognizing us and giving us a hand. Because while we are not going to see that we can see the man, but we can see the food. And there's a whole anyway. We are going to fight for this. We are going to fight for our rights. And we don't have jobs. We are fighting for them. And we don't have houses for you. Some of our houses are gone. One for them, the biography, one for biography, one for biography. I was like asking myself, disability is not something that we can do because it's moving. If you look at moving in 1994, take disability and take disconnect and take disconnect. As I'm standing here, I have the ability. I can walk, I can sing, I can write. Then why do they say disability? Why do they discriminate us as disability? Yes, I can live life. Yes, I can live life. But that does not make me a disability. Because when I live in life as a disability, meaning that you are free, meaning that you don't care about us. Meaning that you don't have so much access to Christians who are born, who died. That is April. Viva Presidency! Viva! Amanda! Commander, morning.
Commander Floyd Nico, the General Secretary, we are PCC here. We are the Progressive Civics Congress. Obviously, speaking into Zabasha, addressing the bread and butter issues, Zabasha was a Gauteng, advocating for the civic work of the community. And if you look at us, we are saying Progressive Civics Congress. We are also saying this issue of silos, while we are all pursuing the same agenda of the progressive left, cannot be correct. We need to reconcile and find a common ground where when we hit harder, so that those that must listen, they must listen attentively. So that's what we are, commanders. Without wasting time, commanders, let me greet the National High Command, today led by Comrade Floyd Nico, SHIVAMBU, to the regional detachment of MK, led by the leadership of Manyembe. And in the regional detachment of MK, it's an honor for us today to be invited as PCC to give a message of support. It will be a mistake for me to also forget to greet our traditional leadership, our faith-based leadership, including all other distinguished guests that are present today. I want a message of support from the PCC, the Progressive Civics Congress. We say it is a deep revolutionary pride and profound humility that we stand before you today at this significant gathering, where we gather not only to celebrate the legacy of a towering giant of our resilience, loyalty, and uncompromising dedication to the ideas of justice, freedom, and African unity. President Zuma belongs to the rare breed of leaders who sacrifice their youth so that the future generations live in dignity. He walked the dusty roads of KwaZulu-Natal to mobilize our people, that today we are here to enjoy the benefits of their struggle. President Zuma, as the commander and the president of the people, during his tenure, we saw over 70 million of South Africans access social grants. Free higher education for the poor became a policy. The state laid the foundation for what we say today is the National Higher Insurance. He championed the cause of radical that they support them must be loud and clear. From the suburbs of Gauteng to the townships of Gauteng, that Progressive Civics Congress proudly and apologetically supports Umkhonto we party. We do so not for personal glory, but because our values are aligned. Our constituents are the same, and our mission are intertwined. Gauteng provides almost about a third of the GDP, but yet there's a lot of sheds and a lot of buildings that are not good for one to be occupied. So there is a lot to do here in Gauteng. We say that economic growth without redistribution is oppression. Gauteng must become the epicenter of black development, and that starts with political power rooted in the middle class. MK party is the only political vehicle for us as the PCC today. With the courage to complete the task of economic freedom, land restitution, and people-led government. And we say to us, it's not a breakaway, it is homecoming. A return to the original vision of the liberation struggle. And we say in our communities from Ekurhuleni to Tshwane, from Alexander to Sibuke, PCC structures are mobilizing behind the MK party. President Zuma's legacy is not an ancient relic, it is a living call to action. You are not too young to fight for the people, you are not too young to lead, you are not too young to speak power to truth. Amanda! Happy birthday, Shosi, happy birthday! Long live
from the Church Apostolic Church in Christ, we are aligning the structures to the cities, the world, and also the prophets. So, now we are going to SG, now we are going to take.
Leadership ya MK, the National Command, that from Zuma yanyele. Ripilele, Kamalala, ripilele. Amanda. Awe, two. Sababa bakulu ikomu ikensile na limuha. Thank you very much, Program Director, who is a member of the National High Command, Commander Lugan Ibelo. We want to take this opportunity first to greet our President in absentia, President Jacob Gedletleki Samhlanganela Zuma, and send our birthday wishes on behalf of the entire organization of Condowe Season and on behalf of majority of voters and the people and the public of South Africa. Because Condowe Season represents majority of people and majority of voters in South Africa. We will of course illustrate that with the process that we're engaged in the courts of law, but also we're going to decisively illustrate that Condowe Season represents majority of the people in South Africa when we go to the 2026 local government elections and the 2029 general elections, where Condowe Season is going to record a decisive victory. We want to greet the ex-combatants, military veterans of Condowe Season, the Liberation Army, of the forces that come from APLA, and all the military veterans from all the fighting forces that fought for total freedom and emancipation. We want to greet the leadership of Condowe Season Women's League, which in terms of the program that was adopted by the National High Command is supposed to launch in August 2025. It's led here by the National Coordinator in the Wemcha. Condowe Season Youth League is currently holding a program in KwaMashu in Etegwini. The leadership, majority of them are there, but for the leadership of the province here with us. Condowe Season Students Movement, which is the fastest growing student movement in South Africa today, and winning majority of the student representative councils that are taking place. Want to create the leadership of Manda Ashu Workers Union of South Africa. So MAUSA is a union that organizes workers, mostly those who work in the expanded public works program, the EPWP. So if you are a worker in EPWP, even if that job was given to you by councillors of other parties, you must know that the largest union that represents workers in EPWP, and it's called MAUSA. It's associated with Condowe Season. We also want to acknowledge Condowe Season people with disabilities. So Condowe Season National High Command, as part of building Condowe Season as a revolutionary movement, we have decided and resolved to constitute a desk that is going to have presence at one level, at sub-regional level, regional level, provincial level, and have independent national leadership to specifically look on issues of people with disabilities. So we have a structure of people with disabilities. We also want to acknowledge the leadership of the Progressive Civics Congress, PCC. You must take note of the leadership of PCC that was saying it must be bigger than SAMCO. Leadership of the zones and sub-regions, the leadership of regions, the provincial detachment of Gauteng province, and want to congratulate upfront the leadership of Gauteng for having organized this birthday celebration of President Zuma here in Gauteng with very little, if no resources. So that is a demonstration of leadership that knows what it is doing. We also want to acknowledge the servants from the African Transformation Movement, the ATM, which is our strategic ally. So if you want to know what is the relationship between the MK and ATM, you must just understand the simple fact that when the ballot is printed in 2026 and 2029, ourselves, condolences, and all members and supporters of ATM, so voted the whole day. That is the strategic alliance and unification of all the progressive forces that were taking. But most importantly, comrades want to create and acknowledge the ground forces of condolences, who are the lifeblood of this organization. We are not going to have an organization without active ground forces that do work of the movement and want to treat the people of South Africa who have joined us through different models and modes to interact with us. I want to specifically acknowledge Professor Sipho Sien, who is going to speak today here as part of countering the narrative around President Jacob Zuma. Comrades in all provinces today, the 12th of April, which is the birthday of President Jacob Zuma, we have got programs and different speakers and activities that are beginning to speak. There has never been a project of the white capitalist minority system. There is not a single handler under apartheid, post-apartheid, even when President Zuma was in prison. There is not a single handler who can say that they handled President Zuma and they told him what to do. So all provinces are countering the narrative that seeks to denigrate, that seeks to erode the contribution of President Zuma in the struggles against apartheid colonialism and in the struggle for total emancipation. Defying President Zuma is that one is a humble servant of the people. And that is what makes him great. There is no one who can ever rise to greatness unless they are humble. President Zuma is the most humble of leaders. Number two is that President Zuma is highly knowledgeable. You know, President Zuma is one of the most knowledgeable political leaders. There are so many people who have gone to schools and received certificates who even now do not even have a quarter of the knowledge that President Zuma has about the issues that affect our people. Also about what is happening in the continent. Also about what is happening in the world. When he realizes that this is not legitimate, it's not genuine, he takes decisions. He doesn't wait for tomorrow. He takes decisions on things that have to protect the interests of the people. The most consistent, number 5, he is the most consistent defender of the freedom charter.
that those who are leading the former liberation movement, the African National Congress,
have abandoned the Freedom Charter and will not take the role of defending the Freedom Charter. Some of us were fortunate in October 2023 to get a political presentation and discussion on why Umkhonto sees as a party must be formed to represent majority of our people. In that discussion, President Zuma highlighted two most important things. One, he spoke about unity of the progressive forces.
And illustrated a simple fact that for many centuries now, for many decades, we as black people, the African majority, the people who look like me and you, have been under a system of colonial conquest. Whatever you can wish, even if you can listen to a motivational speaker or read motivational books that says that I'm not conquered, all the material conditions and illustrations about us black people here in South Africa is that we are still a conquered and defeated people. That is shown by a simple fact that we do not own our own land. Majority of the land is still in the hands and control of the colonial invaders, the colonial settlers, and their descendants.
Have been under a system of colonial conquest. Whatever you can wish, even if you can listen to a motivational speaker or read motivational books,
our space is everything that defines us is controlled by the colonial settlers. And President Zuma says the reason why in that situation is because in our wars of resistance against colonialism, we did not fight as a unified whole. The colonial invaders, they fought us in different battles. They were numerically, in terms of the numbers, they were far fewer than all of us. And to illustrate that, those of you who have studied history properly, go and check the battle which the oppressed majority won was the Battle of Isandlwana. And in that battle, we were able to defeat the white settlers because numerically we were far much bigger than them. We had superior capacity to resist colonial invasion. But the fact that all other battles we fought as small and unviable tribes and clans, that is why we got to be defeated and subjected to colonial rule, which is still a reality to this day. Colonialism has not yet been defeated. Why? Because black people have been fighting in small corners. And that is when he said then that we need to unite all the progressive forces to fight for total emancipation. And that is the agenda that we understood very well, that what role are these small political parties playing when you know that you have demonstrated over whatever number of years that you can't take political power? Why do you still want to exist as a separate political party instead of consolidating and pursue a bigger cause for total emancipation? And he said that Umkhonto must therefore become a movement for unification of all genuinely anti-colonial, anti-racist, progressive forces to realize total freedom. And you know, in October
2023, the white parties and their puppets were already forming something called Moonshot Pact. That time, President Zuma says that don't pay attention to this Moonshot Pact. He says, what I know now is that the whites are going to take over the African National Congress. You know, at that time it did not look possible. He says, I know now that the whites are going to take over the ANC and they are going to form government together, and then they will continue to oppress us like they've been doing for many years. They are going to actually make oppression to be even far much more harsher on all of us. Long before there were the fake discussions on whether there must be government of national unity or so forth, President Zuma saw it in October, even earlier than that the ANC is going to merge with the Democratic Alliance to further protect the interests of the white minority. And we, in that discussion, say, let's go and contest as different political parties that we must later on get to reunite to fight for our total freedom. So, comrades, don't ever listen to anyone who will say, no, President Zuma doesn't know anything. He knows properly what he's talking about. You know, in my other work when I was still growing up in my 20s, I used to work as part of the political educators of the South African Communist Party and COSATU and all its affiliates. And on several occasions, even before the Polokwane conference of the ANC, where President Zuma was elected decisively as the president of the ANC, he will come to conduct political education for a lot of COSATU affiliates. And the extent and depth of knowledge that he will give, you will realize he will make exact references to very complex manuscripts. You will speak without any reference to anything. The first part of the Communist Manifesto that speaks about that the history of the hitherto existing society is a history of class struggle. You will speak clearly about that and still be able to explain that as to what it means.
You will speak with eloquence as to what dialectical materialism is. You will define what science is. Those of you who have watched the several videos where he speaks about science and scientific politics, he defines science and he simplifies it for everyone else to understand. He would say that science is knowledge that is gained through observation, critically proven, assessed, and found to be true beyond any reasonable doubt. And we ourselves as students of the revolution, we got to understand that much more clearly. You know, in September last year, when Mkondo Sizwe was adopting the constitution of Mkondo Sizwe, he spoke at length about the global balance of forces. And part of the things that President Zuma was saying then, last year, he said that if these people knew what is coming, they were going to intensify our trade relationships with our friends in the BRICS bloc, because when he realized that the West is taking a different shape, he's the one who went to join BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. It became BRICS because of President Zuma and the addition of South Africa. Last year already he had already foreseen that the West is going to behave in the manner it is doing now. He said that if there was leadership in this country, they would be intensifying our trade relationships with our friends, because he could foresee just what was happening. I thought we must just highlight those key values. But let's talk about President Zuma, so that the MK students movement, the Youth League, and the young people of South Africa and the generations to come should know just who are we talking about biographically when we speak about President Jacob Zuma. He was born exactly 83 years ago on the 12th of April 1942.
Nkandla. So Nkandla is not the name of his home state. Nkandla is a very huge area, it's a municipality in the Kinkatay region of KwaZulu-Natal. The specific area that President Zuma was born in is called KwaDunuzi. So those who can translate that can translate as to what are the things. And he spent most of his youth and early stages in KwaDunuzi. But at the age of 17, he joined the African National Congress. Because when he joined the African National Congress in 1958, 1959, it was still the only fighting instrument in the hands of black people. Black people did not have a vehicle to fight for their emancipation. There was no any other instrument to fight for total emancipation. He then joined the African National Congress. He actually says that when he was joining, I heard him say that myself, that he was so fervent to join Kenya that he had to not give his correct aid so that they could allow him to join the African National Congress. He later on joined the South African Communist Party, recruited by one of the great trade unionists called Moses Mabhida, who was the General Secretary at some stage of the South African Congress of Trade Unions, SAFTU, who also became the General Secretary of the South African Communist Party. So President Zuma, amongst others, is a product of General Secretary Moses Mabhida. President Zuma was in 1963 when he was joining Umkhonto of the Liberation Army. Now let's understand this clearly. Umkhonto of the Liberation Army is launched on the 16th of December 1961 with a clarion call which starts with the question of, there comes a time at the period of a nation whether you decide, when you have to decide whether you submit or you fight.
Umkhonto is launched officially on 16 December 1961, and already as part of the first consignment of recruits into Mkhonto season, the Liberation Army, part of those included President Jacob Zuma in his early 20s, in his late teens, early 20s. But we have got people at the ages of 18, 19, 20 who are still saying, I want mama for this, mama for this, mama for that. By that time, President Zuma was willing to take up arms, to fight, to kill for the revolution of our people. And he was then arrested in 1963 at the age of 21 and sentenced to 10 years in prison. He was then taken to Robben Island for exactly 10 years. And he spent the 10 years in Robben Island, not just as a prisoner, also as a student of the revolution, as a student of what should be done, what is to be done. Amongst his many teachers in Robben Island was Comrade Harry Gwala. He speaks, President Zuma speaks fondly and memorably, vividly about the political schools that would be run by Comrade Harry Gwala in Robben Island. And he was in Robben Island at the same time as the time of the Rivonia trialists. But Robben Island was divided. There were those who were arrested in the 60s later, were separated from the Rivonia trialists of Nelson Mandela, Govan Mbeki, Walter Sisulu, Pedro Mlange. But the divisions, the sections where President Zuma was, used to always consult the leadership of the liberation forces on the other section of Robben Island. So he always recounts, I know this firsthand, of a discussion which took years on whether the African National Congress is socialist in character or capitalist in character. And the section where President Zuma was discussed over many years, wrote a document and sent to the other side that please resolve this question. And then they came back after more than a year and said the reason we couldn't come back to you is because even ourselves were not found each other as to just whether we are socialist in character or capitalist in character. But one thing that we can affirm is that our struggles as of now are defined by the aims and objectives of the Freedom Charter. So the Freedom Charter has been a clarion call, a uniting perspective of all the movement that fought against apartheid and colonialism. Do you know the African National Congress was never a threat to the colonial and apartheid government until the adoption of the Freedom Charter.
Until the adoption of the Freedom Charter that says that no government can claim authority over the people unless it's based on their will. There was no threat on the apartheid government until a Freedom Charter that said the mineral wealth beneath the soil, the banks, and monopoly industry shall be transferred to the ownership of the people as a whole. Charter to say that you advocate for this communist document. You advocate for this document which wants to take away white domination over the economy, white domination over society, white domination over political power of South Africa. So Exhibit 1 in the Court of Law in the prison trial was the Freedom Charter. And that is the ideals that President Zuma stands for. Make no mistake, you can go and listen, all of us now have got access to the so many perspectives and the interviews that President Zuma does. When he was in Ghana on the 7th of January 2025, on the 8th he conducted an interview with Channel 1 TV. You must attentively listen as to how he places the Freedom Charter at the center of our struggle as Umkhonto sees it. You must listen to the interview he did substantial with RT, like Russian television, and how he places at the center of our struggle the Freedom Charter. And why is it relevant is because it has been a clarion call for all the revolutionary forces. So if you have not yet come across the many other documents and perspectives of Umkhonto, just go and read the Freedom Charter and understand what it says. Our Constitution now says, amongst other perspectives that are going to drive the agenda of Umkhonto will be the Freedom Charter. So President Zuma learned and understood the Freedom Charter and its essence when he was imprisoned for 10 years in Robben Island as a political prisoner. He was released in 1973. And in that intervening period, he then got married to Makuma. It's very important to say that. And then, that is 1973, got married in 1974, he then led the African National Congress underground formations in the Natal province. In 1975, he went to Swaziland. He was going there for a mission.
With an understanding that he's still a newlywed young person. Just going into Swaziland and had to come back, but when he got there, he was then instructed that he must remain in Swaziland. That is when his exile years began. He spent all the years from 1975 until the early 1990s in exile. He was the chief representative of the African National Congress in Mozambique. He led the intelligence department of Umkhonto Sizwe, the Liberation Army. He trained and received majority of those who went to exile after the June 16, 1976 uprising. So after the June 16 uprising here in Soweto, there was an outflux from South Africa of exiles who went to join Umkhonto Sizwe, the Liberation Army. And a substantial number of those were received and trained by President Zuma. Trained them politically and trained them militarily with an understanding of what later on got to be said by Thomas Sankara that a soldier without proper ideological and political training is a potential criminal. So throughout his life, he got to do that work.
And then, when the African National Congress and other liberation movements were unbanned, they then came back to South Africa. In 1991, the African National Congress held its conference in KwaZulu-Natal in Durban, Westville. President Zuma was elected as the Deputy Secretary General of the AIDS, DSG of the AIDS. His SG was someone else, I forgot his name, he comes from around here. And he knew then that it was a mistake for a liberation movement to elect whoever was his SG when he was a TSG. But he remained in humility told, here's a situation, 1991, he is a national official of the African National Congress. Despite that, in 1994, when the democratic dispensation is ushered in, he was leading the Southern Natal component of the three regions of the Natal province. And then he subsequently became the chair of the Natal province. But when elections happened in 1994, 27 April, he is an official of the ANC. People get elected, they go to parliament. President Mandela says to him, come in and form part of the national cabinet. He says, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm still here in the province. He then, with humility, participated in the government of KwaZulu-Natal, which was led by the IFP. That demonstrates humility, comrades. That even when you have got strong struggle credentials, even when you know that you have been exposed to higher platforms,
You must also accept to be led at some stage. It can't be that every time that, no, it's me here. I'm in control every time there's a leadership issue. It's me. President Zuma was a member of the Executive Council and NEC in the KwaZulu-Natal government, which was not led by a party that he belonged to for many years. Despite being an official of the African National Congress, despite having weekly meetings with the head of state, with President Mandela and all of those things, after that, back to KwaZulu-Natal. And then in 1997, he was elected as the Deputy President of the African National Congress. President was Mr. Tabombe. And during his term, he allowed to be led. Even when he was undermined, given lesser responsibilities, treated with disdain by President Mbeki and his lieutenants. The abuse of President Zuma happened when he was the Deputy President of the ANC. Left, right, and center. All sorts of charges concocted against him. Threatened with imprisonment every day. Appointed Deputy President of the Republic of South Africa in 1999. And later on got fired in a humiliating way. Deputy President of the Republic, President Mbeki took all the powers which he had himself as deputy to President Mandela, and possibly left President Zuma with the convening the South African National AIDS Council. But the strategic powers which Mr. Mbeki had when he was a deputy president were shifted away.
He undermined, denigrated him, and later on said, "You are potentially going to be charged in a court of law because you are potentially corrupt or you are corrupt. So I'm removing you as the deputy president of the Republic of South Africa." And even during that period, he still operated within the organization with humility and did his work as a leader of the movement. And a lot of people were treating President Zuma during that period like he has got leprosy. You know, in the Bible, Archbishop Zon, the people who had leprosy were isolated. And a large number of people got to isolate him during that period and say, "No, this one is not wanted by chief." And we all know that in the 2007 52nd conference of the ANC, he was elected as the president of the African National Congress with a decisive margin. The margin was more than 1,000 votes of the delegates that were there. I was there. And we were celebrating his election that time. And you know, this is what happens. 2007 is elected president. 2008, we at that time get elected as the National Executive Committee of the African National Congress this week. And those of us who were elected as the National Executive Committee of the ANC were all of us who were associated and supported President Zuma, all of us. And then in September 2008, the National Executive Committee of the ANC takes a correct decision to recall former President Mbeki as the head of state and president. And you know, many people say it was a mistake. It was not a mistake. I was that time in the Tula House full time. Spent 5 years in the Tula House full time. I was the national spokesperson of the ANC.
There was no way the National Executive Committee was not going to recall him. Do you know, at the beginning of each year, there must be a Yuhuka that discusses of the ANC what government must implement. You will come there and say, "No, we cannot release some of these documents to you guys because these are top secret." Cabinet is going to decide. He had created a dichotomy between the ANC and government that time, 2008. And then the National Executive Committee of the ANC took a correct decision to recall him as the head of state and president. Even when President Mbeki was recalled, when President Zuma was the president, he did not say that, "I'm going to enter now." He didn't do that. He said, "No, let's take Deputy President Khanombo Tato to be an acting president. Me, I will come in my own accord. I'm going to be elected by the people of South Africa. I'm not going to enter through a corner like this one who is the head of state now, who entered in 2018 through the corner. By himself, he was unable to get more than 50% of the vote, Mr. Ramaphosa. But President Zuma said, I'm the president of the ANC, there's no need for me to, I'm going to go and campaign for me to be elected directly as a president of the country. And he went on the ground to campaign in a clear way, and we can say this without any fear of contradiction. As an attempt to stop President Zuma from being a head of state and president, President Mbeki associated with the formation of COPE, the Congress of the People, that time. He was the demigod, he was the one. That is why the entirety of his cabinet, all his lieutenants, went to join COPE with the hope that they will stop the rise of President Jacob Zuma as the head of state and president. With COPE in existence, COPE which had former ministers, it had multi-millionaires who had benefited from the BEE of Mbeki. It had a former deputy president of the country, Pumzile Mlambo. They could not stop the rise of President Zuma at the time, because the people of South Africa understood President Jacob Zuma. They knew who he is and that he is one with the people. You know, if you read elections properly and then you count one by one, Prof, the number of people who voted for President Zuma to be president, they are just slightly lower than those who voted for President Mandela. But President Mbeki, anyone else who has ever led the ANC, has never received the highest number of voters than President Zuma. And these are the realities that got to define just what got to happen. Now, comrades, we're going to allow Professor Symposium to speak about the so many achievements that he achieved when he was head of state and president.
When he was head of state and president, the doors of learning and culture were open. The number of free schools were increased under President Zuma when he was head of state and president. When he was head of state and president of the country, he kept peace. You will know historically had negotiated the peace in Burundi, but there was no conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Why? Because President Zuma paid particular attention to the Democratic Republic of Congo. You know, when he deployed the ground forces to go and keep peace in the DRC, he also had an Air Force base behind the ground forces. Air Force base, South Africa has got the biggest and most sophisticated air capacity in terms of military. And the rebels knew that if you touch the South African peacekeepers or peacekeeping mission, you won't be able to counter the Air Force. That is why during his presidency, there was peace in the DRC. And he used to go himself to speak to the soldiers on the ground and inspire them and explain to them the necessary vision of keeping the DRC and the entirety of the African continent safe. The reason why South Africa has lost 14 soldiers now in the eastern part of the DRC is because there is no more air capacity to counter the rebels. because Ramaphosa has surrendered the military capacity of South Africa. Everywhere else is supposed to find expression. So South Africa is vulnerable to even village armies, to even security companies. They can just intimidate our soldiers because we do not have the capacity which President Zuma got to build. But also President Zuma empowered black people. It's not a secret, even statistically. You can prove that more and more black people were getting richer and their lives getting better under President Zuma. The most strategic thing that was done by President Zuma, which we explained earlier, was to join BRICS. To have to know who are our friends at the global level. Now, comrades, between the 22nd and 28th of March, we had a meeting of the National High Command. I'm closing now. So, in an atypical way, and in an unusual way, you know, a meeting of the National High Command must start with the address, political report or address by the President. Then he said you must read the organizational report first and then you will come in later. So the organizational report had come with a political section and then administrative issues, organization, all the fraternal organizations, what's happening with the Women's League, Youth League, Student Movement. And he sat there to listen to members of the National High Command to talk about controversies of the party and to talk about controversies of the movement. He listened for the whole day. The next day he listened up until lunchtime. And then he came, he says that, why is it that you as members of the National High Command,
how do we take power now to take power now? And then he said, a very clear agenda, he says that before the end of this meeting, I want you to come with clearly defined 5 or 6 or whatever number of priority areas of discussion as to how do we take power here in South Africa. That is why we came with the 5 areas. One, which is the controversies, revolutionary path to state power.
So what that means is that because currently our path to power involves elections, there must never be a meeting of Mkondo season where we do not discuss our path to power. You know, the word path to power is familiar for those who read South Africa's political literature. It was a title of a South African Communist Party document called South African Path to Power. I think it was issued in 1989 in the Havana Congress of the South African Communist Party, where President Zuma was elected as a Politburo member of the SACP. And later on, for tactical reasons, because he was at the center of negotiations, was advised to step out of the leadership of the SACP to focus on the ANC because he was at the core of the talks before talks. So in conversations, the primary focus now is MK's revolutionary path to state power. 2, we must define as activists as structures of Mkondo.
As a sub-region of Mkondo season, as a region of Mkondo season, you must sit down and talk who are the people we should have strategic and tactical alliances with. Which ones? Here in Johannesburg, Gauteng province, Comrade Convener, you must know which are the largest black constituted institutions and formations here in Gauteng province. There's a gathering in Zuma this coming Easter. There's a gathering in Orlando Stadium this coming Easter. What is the role of Mkhonto in those gatherings, and what are those gatherings? There are so many gatherings that are taking place where our people are. What is the strategic and tactical relationship that Mkhonto is going to have with all these formations of black people? And in our characterization of the domestic, strategic and tactical alliances and friends, we even took time to give characterization of other political formations. Some are enemy forces, some are contested opponents. And you know, you must understand that an enemy you crush, but an opponent you persuade to see things the way you see them. That is what we learn from President Zuma. He says that even in PEP, even on or just persuade that this is the direction we're taking as a movement. We must not be patient with anyone. We must be able to relate with each other. That is what we learn from our Commander General, Commander Mhlanganyelwa Gedlehlekisa Zuma. The other aspect, comrades, is who are our friends at the global level, at an international level. Of course, we've got friendship which we must enhance and harness with Brazil, Russia, India, China, and all the progressive countries. But a fresh, clear resolution which Mkhonto the National High Command has taken is that we must foster meaningful and mutually beneficial relationship with the progressive anti-colonial countries and forces in the Sahel region of the continent. We must associate with Burkina Faso and Captain Ibrahim Traore. Long live Ibrahim Traore, long live. And we must associate with the progressive forces in Niger and Mali. Of course, we want the democratic change of government. But the overthrow of the puppet regimes of France in the Sahel region was progressive. We will associate as well with what we hope and believe will be a progressive government in Gabon. There's elections today in Gabon. And we wish that the progressive forces must emerge to intensify the struggle for total emancipation. Comrades, we must never be ashamed of President Zuma. He is a revolutionary. He is one of our own. He is us and we are him. No one must make you doubt about that. They have tried everything to bury him. He is still standing. And the people of South Africa understand President Zuma. The people of the African continent understand President Zuma because he is one with the people. We were in Namibia now to inaugurate Commander Triple N. The people of Namibia, when they introduced the head of state of South Africa,
just looked at him and were shocked of what's happening. What is this? But when they introduced President Zuma, the people of Namibia, African continent, they said, where is our president? Where is our leader? must never be ashamed of our president. And the best honor we can give to him is to remain disciplined, is to remain respectful, is to be honest, is to do hard work for the organization. So comrades, thank you very much. The professor is going to come and speak about the people. Amanda! Let me President Zuma, let me! 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 Let you let as well as the provincial leadership, that so it fits that I should actually come and share my perspective, not so much as an outsider, because you cannot be outside the struggles of African people. Any black person who says he's independent, you should know that there's something wrong with that black person. How do you live in a township and claim to be independent when people talk about the issues that affect you? So I'm speaking also as an insider out or outsider who's also in. I am not saying I'm applying for membership, just yet. Well, a friend of mine sent me a note right now, which disturbed me. And he said, in what capacity are you speaking? And I remember the question was asked to Desmond Tutu by P.W. Bosa, who asked, Bishop, let me be very clear. Are you speaking to me as a bishop or as a politician? And Tutu took a minute. He says, never mind whether I'm speaking as a bishop or as a politician, but are the things I'm saying true or false? And he paralyzed me the boss. So my friend who asked that question, I hope you are listening. I also want to acknowledge the ground forces. These are the people who volunteer to ensure that the struggle continues. I also note the technical and strategic relationship that we have with ATM. And I think the unity of African people is very important, and it could not have been more important than now. So, sir, you are acknowledged. And of course, the traditional leadership, you are also acknowledged.
I thought I should change a little bit of a track from the presentation I made, but also to build up on the issue of the successes of President Zuma. But SG, when he talked about that he's a humble servant, you're talking about something that I had observed when I was in government. To an extent that I did not know, how do you approach somebody who is so humble and yet he's a president? So I found myself tongue-tied, always in his presence because of his humility. But let me give you the most surprising and shocking expression of that humility. Is when President Zuma joined heads of state, kings, to go and bury Fidel Castro. He had just come from burying Fidel Castro when he later heard that a young child suffering from progeria, who was living in most humble conditions, had died. And when President Zuma heard that, this is a man who had been in the presence of kings, presidents, prime ministers, and yet he says, I'm going to cancel my day to be with that child. All the bishops that you always see, who never cease to see an opportunity to appear on television, were not there. President Zuma went to the funeral of the most humblest of South African citizens. That is a mark of leadership. That is a mark of humility. Something you do not find in this country. But it's also important for me to mention, given that I'm given this platform, as somebody who is an observer, political observer, and anything that I'm saying here is something that I had written. So you can always find that if you Google me. I wrote many years ago, or actually sometime many months ago, that the emergence of Umkhonto weSizwe is a result of the failure of the ANC to deliver on its historical mission. The ANC, whose mission was anchored on the liberation of black people in general, and African in particular, has now been reduced to nothing more than a willing defender of white monopoly capital. The ANC of Ramaphosa is simply made of a busload of colonial clerks and administrators. How else can you explain that you have an administration that is so timid, so scared to even change the name of the street? If you can't change a street name, what can you do? But we should not be surprised that the only thing that the President Ramaphosa has achieved, Comrade LG, is fixing a pothole
on the ground of the road. We members of the ANC excited. How low can you get? At the center of conversation is Jacob Zuma, a person with a magnetic appeal. It is true that the Jacob Zuma is arguably the most popular politician in the country after former President Nelson Mandela. And it's also a matter of history and effect that on a draw-to-draw basis, his political rivals, which included the Tamil League and Khanma Mutante, found themselves on the proverbial canvas. It doesn't matter how much they have in power today, but the truth is, when it came to a contest, a political contest that was open, none of them could match President Zuma. As I've argued elsewhere, that the former President Mbeki, with his master's degree in economics from Sussex, was outsmarted by a peasant in a political game of chess. Imagine someone with a master's degree in economics being a head of state, being outsmarted by somebody they look down upon. This is not an imagination, it is a fact. The insults and consistent denigration of Msholozi's person have not diminished the expression of adoration he receives wherever he goes. The SG has just told what an embarrassing spectacle we saw in Namibia, where a sitting president gets introduced and the people treat the president as if he was a jaywalker. And when Msholozi's name was mentioned, there was a sustained rapturous applause. But what it shows is that the people know their leader. The people's love for Msholozi is inscribed in their hearts, not in the mainstream media. Ironically, it was Mbalula when he reflected on the outcome of the elections. He said, and I quote him, EFF, DA, all smaller political parties combined did not defeat the ANC. Jacob Zuma did. And then he continued when he looked at the destination of the ANC in KZN. He says, in KZN, we are fighting a Ferrari with a Toyota Conquest. So we need to match that with a flying machine. But he was acknowledging that you cannot take that away from Msholozi. And for his part, the commander-in-chief of the Economic Freedom Front, when he confronted Raymond Zondo, who seemed to suffer from a bout of amnesia, he said to him, I accept that Zuma is not Mandela. But when you come from KZN, Zuma is the Mandela of KZN. And he continues. He says, that is why you, Raymond Zondo,
you have a lying judge. That there is no reason why you can say you can meet this person twice and you remember all the details, but you don't remember what you discussed. And this is the same chair of the commission who was forcing other people to remember what they can't remember. The most interesting thing is that, of course, Zona is not alone in forgetfulness. But there's also another one who lies all the time. The president of this country has mastered or perfected the art of lying. To an extent that it took another president of another country to tell them, Chief, stop lying. We can't be having a discussion and you go out and say all these things. So we know that it's the same president who went to Alexander, said he was going to build 1 million houses. And then he goes, I mean, how dare you lie like that? He said, we went to listen to the tapes. And when we listened to it, there was no way we talked about 1 million houses. And yet the tapes exist. The recordings are there. And for her part, Helen Zille, in thinking about Mkondwesizi, she says when she heard that Msholozi is going to start a party, she says, my political analysis failed me because I thought this party couldn't get anywhere. There's no way that the party led by Zuma is going to have any traction. I've never been more wrong. Those are the power of identity politics as people choose it for themselves, unquote. But where Helen Zille is dishonest, and many white people are dishonest on this, is that when black people vote for a black party, they are driven by identity politics. But when white people vote for white parties, it is never identity politics. So these are some of the continuous insults that are heaped on African people. But this is a level of dishonesty that we must come to accept. I wanted to pick up on the issue that the SG was talking about. Yet Africans, who constitute about 80% only, are occupied in small spaces, congested in those conditions of squalor, and they occupy only 4%. And I must say, as Africans, irrespective of every political party, we should hang our heads in shame. How can the majority of the people who are indigenous to the place occupy only less than 4%? And we go around pretending that all is well. This is why the idea of radical socio-economic transition makes a lot of sense. Nothing makes more sense than that. But you need to also understand that we made no progress. Africans in 1913 were in the same position. So what it means is, with all the struggles over the last 100 years, we have not made progress in terms of the land issue. We are no worse than, or we are even worse than what Maji said. He says, and I quote, awakening on Friday morning, June 20, 1913, the South African native found himself not actually a slave, but a pariah in the land of his birth. This is the first bitter truth. So, in terms of the assignment, we must put, how are we going to get our land back? You can't be occupying 4%, and you have, when I drive to KZN or to Limpopo, you have people, one person owning even a mountain and a river. And this person is not even indigenous to this country. So that is the first thing that we need to look at. But SG, I'll tell you what happened in 1994. This is where our pain and our struggle was hijacked. Neville Alexander, in his book, Some Are More Equal Than Others, he says that what happened in 1994 is no different from what happens when the slave owner going to the United States with a cargo of black slaves discovers
that there is a hole in the ship, and he calls people to say, look, I'm going to loosen your chains, help me, we are in this together. And they keep the slaves chained, but the slaves participate in their own survival, but the ship does not change, it still continues to slave land. So what was happening in 1994 is simply we participated in our own oppression. So, but part of it is that we bought into the notion, the first lie, and to perpetuate apartheid, to undermine black struggles. And in this case, they used institutions. The first institution that they used was the mainstream media, the one that was there to create a master narrative. The second one was to use the churches. The third one that they used was the academy, universities. The fourth one was the judiciary. And what they did, which is something that Ronald Mani has always written about, is to start putting the judiciary above all other. So what we end up with is the judicialization of South African society. That if there's a dispute, you want to have a judge. If there's a problem in the school, you bring a judge. If there's a squabble in the family, you bring a judge. And in the process, even when Parliament has a problem, it becomes an issue of the courts. But what it does, it undermines the will of the people. So you cannot continue with this arrangement where the will of the people gets undermined always by the courts. And also, by the way, some of us went to school with these judges. And some of them were not right. Just because somebody is wearing a gown does not make them any brighter. You know also, as a matter of fact, that the former Chief Justice, Zondo, under normal circumstances should not have been a judge or even a Chief Justice. I mean, here's a man who was asked, in a public space, public platform. He was the best performer, and yet he gets chosen. So you ask, what was this process of the judicial service all about, where people are paraded, and the worst performer gets elected or nominated and appointed? I mean, it is, we are actually undermining and insulting ourselves. It's like going to a boxing match, and you have two boxers, and one is beating the pulp, he can't even rise, and the referee says, and the winner is, and they pick up that. This is what happened in the Judicial Service Commission, and we end up with the Chief Justice that we have. So we need to start interrogating these things very sharply. And Mandela won in 1997, and he had this to say about the media. He says, and I quote, even a cursory study of positions adopted by mainly white parties in the national legislature during the last 3 years, the National Party, the Democratic Party, and the Freedom Front, will show that they and the media, which represents the same social base, have been the most vigorous in their opposition. So even at that time, Mandela warned about the role of the media. And then he did not leave it there. He then went to mention also groupings that we should be concerned about. And those are what you call the NGOs. And this is what Mandela said about the NGOs. And I quote, many of our non-governmental organizations are not in fact NGOs, both because they are not popular, they have no popular base, and the actuality that they rely on domestic and foreign governments rather than the people for their material sustenance. So Mandela at that time identifies the NGOs as part of the problem, that these groupings are not really NGOs because they have no support, social support on the ground. But he says a number of them also rely on foreign governments for their financial sustenance. And he says as we continue the struggle to ensure a people-driven process of social transformation, we will have to consider the reliability of such NGOs as a whole and as a vehicle to achieve our objective. Now here's Mandela identifying the NGOs. Now you need to ask, he identifies the NGOs, he identifies the media, of course the opposition parties you should expect. And look at who are the most vociferous groupings that have been anti-Msholozi. It is the very same things that Mandela warned about. But he says also when he ends, he says the reason why these organizations behave that way and these structures behave that way is because they know in the future they might reverse the gains of democracy. And look at where we are today. You can't even change a street name. And what Mandela feared will happen is simply the threat that the gains of democracy will be reversed. And we know, as a matter of fact, that the last 7 years, we saw the reversal of all of them. The point that the SG was making about even black people were doing better during that time. We even had solved load shedding. But for the last 5 years, we've been having problems. So that is the first, one of the issues that we must address. But what we fail to pick up is, which is why the lecture by SG was so important, is the psychological damage that has happened to us, that we have become a shell of ourselves. And hence we need this spiritual and educational and political nourishment if we are going to grow, or as a people who are still fighting for their freedom. And what the Umkhonto must not do is what the ANC have done. You know, the idea of a broad church is always very nice, appealing, because you accept everything, even rubbish.
So the issue is that when people buy into the counter narrative, the only time I've seen black journalists talk and tell the truth is when they are booted out into systems, and then they tell you that how horrible it is there, how we are. So there is a need for us to be truthful and to make sure that we are able to mount and to deal with those who control the master narrative. And I must say, one must understand that when you talk about the master narrative, you're talking about something that Mzalere calls a thought system, a narrative that guides your thought, a narrative that guides your beliefs, a narrative that guides your beliefs, and even your behavior. So until you do that, and I want to argue that our failures since 1984 has been because we failed to manage the master narrative. Now I thought it would be good for me to pick up a few things that may be more of an assignment. You know, as somebody in the teaching business, we always give people with assignments. So there are a number of assignments that I'm going to give you. But understanding full well that when 1994 came, there was an understanding that for the first time, as black people, we'll be able to control our destiny. Conscious of the fact that freedom, equality, justice, and dignity are essential objectives for the achievement of our legitimate aspirations. And yet, 30 years later, we know that that expectation has proven to be a bad thing. If anything, South Africa today remains a country of two nations, as the former President Thabo Mbeki observed, that one of these nations is white and relatively prosperous, regardless of gender or geographical dispersions. And he said the second nation and larger nation of South Africa is black and poor. This nation lives under conditions of a gross economic, physical, educational, communication, and other infrastructure. What he says that we are very poor. That is the larger nation. In 2017, President Zuma, about 2 decades later, when he made that statement in 1998, Jacob Zuma, in his real State of the Nation address, the last one, this is what he had said. He said, 22 years into our freedom and democracy, the majority of black people are still economically disempowered. They are dissatisfied with the economic gains from liberation. White households earn at least 5 times more than black households. The situation regarding ownership of the economy also mirrors that of the household incomes. The representation of whites at the top management level amounted to 72%, while African representation was simply at 10%. Statistics when it comes to land ownership are depressing. According to the land audit of 2017, white South Africans own 72% of the total farms and agricultural holdings by individual landowners.
You search and you ask which president has delivered more in South Africa than any other president. You'll find one president, Sholosi. And this is not me saying it. This is the internet, the capabilities that you Google that, but you also find that in the website of government. And as I said, the only thing that I remember Ramaphosa to have delivered is the fixing of a pothole in the gravel road. Now here's what AI says about the achievements. It says Jacob Zuma's presidency, this is something that's not written by us, but it's written by an algorithm that is there, is not made by us. Actually, it was Elon Musk as a grok that looked into that. It throws throughout the internet, comments, and tries to summarize to make sense. And it says, Jacob Zuma's presidency showed significant infrastructure investment with over 1 trillion rand spent on electricity, roads, rail, and harbors. The same search engine says education achievements under Msholozi included expanding no-fee schools to over 9 million children and increasing tertiary education access. It continues, says that President Zuma presided on economic development efforts such as the Black Industrialist Program, which was aimed at creation, job creation and transformation. The Black Industrialist Program supported 31 industrialists in 2017 with 3 billion rands, and the expectations were it was going to create 4,400 jobs. This is what I don't say is there for you to get, but you can also find it in the website. Then it continues that under Msholozi, 3 new universities were established. SHIVAMBU, University of Mpumalanga, and the Soweto. Now here's a person who we are told is bereft of education, yet he considers education to be so critical as to establish the post-1994 universities. And of course, when it comes to HIV AIDS, the SG has indicated that it is under him that the life expectancy of Africans improved by almost 10 years. So the whole notion of 9 wasted years was always a lie, a part of the falsification, and something that got repeated now and then by the mainstream media.
The second issue that we need to understand is a mistake that we made. We thought that those people who had benefited from apartheid will suddenly forego the benefits. Now here's a white man who writes about what happened in 1984 when he thinks back. And I want to quote him and you should listen carefully. Manja! Comrades, we've been doing very well. Can we stop having many meetings? Please, let's just be quiet. Please, comrades. Yeah, Johnny Steinbeck writes. He says, the freedom South Africans acquired in 1994. The freedom South Africans acquired in 1994 was mercurial and slippery. Politically, the changes were dramatic. The electorate expanded overnight to include every adult. But the structure of society stayed much the same. And white people remained white people, doing what white people had always done, running the professions, the corporations, the universities, expertise, wealth, technical knowledge, and social confidence. All these remain deeply associated with whiteness. So what John Steinbeck says is that effectively, while we thought we were in this together, what happened for white people, it was simply a strategic retreat. And a retreat that says, we will come back. We'll find a way of coming back. And what they did was to force us to reframe our understanding. And here's the first reframe of our struggle. Our struggle was always a struggle, an anti-colonial struggle. Overnight, our struggle became a human rights struggle. And there's a difference between those two. If you are engaged in the human rights struggle, all you have to do is to simply address the issue of violations. But if you are engaged in the anti-colonial struggle, then you are going to put land as number one. So we allowed ourselves through a master narrative to accept that ours was a human rights struggle. It was not. And the second thing that we did was to treat apartheid as simply acts of individuals, where we then identified individuals who had engaged in what we call egregious acts of violence against the people. This is why you end up with the life of the cock. But anybody who grew up under apartheid knew that apartheid was a system of subjugation of black people, irrespective of wherever you are. You may not have been shot, you may not have been in prison, but you were a victim of apartheid. So overnight, we decided to recraft through the TRC, because during the TRC, what we had, there were people appearing there and talking about what they did, what was done to them, but we never talked about the system.
And yet you have people who jump and say the men achieved nothing. So as South Africans, not only in Congo, it is important that we arm ourselves with the truth, because if we don't do that, other people are going to create truths that serve to subjugate black people. Now, what is to be done?
All colonial tracks that we have. And when you have colonial tracks, you are not going to get anywhere. But you also realize, as we did, that the very same people that were victims of apartheid can easily become the people who mimic what apartheid did. If you remember during COVID-19, when the soldiers, the military, was unleashed on our people, we did not expect that to happen. That we don't expect the democratic government to unleash the military on its own people. And we were also told last week that the military has to explain why people who were simply demonstrating in Protea, why the SHIVAMBU was there. But it shows the extent to which we regress as a people. So, ideological strategy is one of the things that the MK must always have. There are few things that worry me, and they need to be taken seriously, is the weaponization
of the NPA. The NPA has been unleashed against black professionals. But when I say black professionals, if you are black, you are not safe. The most egregious example, which needs to be played many times, is that of Duduzane Zuma. When Duduzane left and was out of the country for a number of years, the media told us that Duduzane was a fugitive from justice. The young man comes home to do the most honorable thing, to bury his brother. He gets arrested on arrival. He gets shackled, taken to court, and he goes to court. There is no case. And what the NPA was responding to, it was responding to the noise that came that is a fugitive from justice. And when the case collapsed, you know what happened? They had to bring another dead case to charge him. But what it shows is the commitment to have this young person or anybody associated with Jacob Zuma into prison. An accident that happened, they charged him with a couple of homicides. And of course, the case also collapsed because it was a long case. But you see how easy the NPA gets used. And it's something that the MPs of the must raise sharply. The same applies to the issue of the judiciary. In a democratic country, given our history of detention without trial, we have a person like a president of Ghana, former president, being detained without trial. I mean, detention without trial is the most egregious, the most heinous form of destruction of people's rights and constitutional rights. But our constitutional court saw nothing, and even the judgment is simply a statement of anger. And this is what Oliver Tambo said. And he was anticipating a situation where you are going to end up with a majority rule. But when he addressed a gathering of the South African Communist Party in London in 1981, he argued, and I quote, "It is inconceivable for liberation to have meaning without a return of the wealth of the country to the people as a whole." And continues, he says, "To allow the existing economic forces to retain their interests intact is to feed the roots of racial supremacy and exploitation, and does not represent even the shadow of liberation." So, if you look at where we are in terms of our economy, this is what Tambo was concerned about. That any liberation that does not address the material wealth, that leaves the economic interest and the economic ownership intact, this is what a sham liberation would look like. And in other words, we are in the middle of a sham liberation. So when Kusholos said in 2017 that what we need is a radical social economic emancipation or transformation, he meant what Oliver Tambo said. But again, the master narrative says, oh, when they said that they want to steal, and our journalists continue to repeat that nonsense, even the black ones. So what we need to do is what the SG said, and he's been very kind. He says we must be very clear about how we approach people. You have opponents and you have enemies. With the enemies you crush. With the opponents you persuade. We had a lot of work to do in persuading our people to liberate themselves, liberate them from what they have become.
the people that you call sellouts. If you have a country where you can't even change the street name, then you must actually have a change. And you have a president who says we will not be bullied. But the following day he rushes said, no, be careful how you receive Rasul. We don't want to upset America. Oh, but you must remember, you must change the name of the state because we must not offend Anglo-Saxon. So this is how far we've actually come. And that's why I agree with the SDE that the strategic objective is not to complain from outside, is to say how do we take power, and so that power becomes an instrument in the service of the people. Radical socio-economic transformation is a fundamental change in the structure, system, institutions, and patterns of ownership, management, and control of the economy in favor of all South Africans, especially the poor, the majority of whom are Africans and female, unquote. That description is deliberate because it says it cannot be piecemeal. Once more of the same will not work.